Good evening and hello. I'm a science teacher, so that makes me feel good when people respond to what I say. My name is Megan Groom. I'm the director of K-12 education and science in the city here at the Academy, and I just would like to welcome you to Crazy or Brilliant, betting on high risk, high reward science. I will represent the crazy, and this will be the brilliant. I would just like to welcome you and thank our generous sponsor for the evening, Research Corporation for Science Advancement. They're celebrating their 100th birthday, and as an almost 200-year-old organization here at the Academy, I would just like to say it gets better as you get older. So, call us in 100 years. We'll all still be here. Before we start, I just wanted to plug a couple of our upcoming Science in the City programs. I'm sorry to say that you missed our oyster program last week that we had, but we do still have pieces of our local food series. On June 5th, we'll be hosting an event to discuss the potential health benefits of red wine and chocolate. Yes, there will be red wine and dark chocolate here. And more specifically, we'll be talking about a fairly controversial topic and a molecule called resveratrol. This event is in conjunction with the Sackler Institute for Nutrition Science here at the Academy, and like I said, there will be red wine and dark chocolate. There were oysters at the last one, just so you know what you missed. I know. On June 26th, we'll be hosting a panel at the Seaport Museum as part of the River to River Festival on local food. I just want to encourage you, both events are close to their maximum registration. So I just want to encourage you to register for those on our website. Now, to kick off the evening, I'd like to introduce Gail Jackson. Gail is the chair of the Board of Directors for Research Corporation for Science Advancement, a co-presenter of tonight's event, and the nation's oldest foundation devoted wholly to science. Gail is also president and CEO of Energy Global Inc. and has more than 35 years of international energy industry experience. Gail?
Thank you, Megan, very much. It's a pleasure to be in this stunning environment and to feel younger than I felt on the tennis court yesterday. We're only 100 years old. You're 194. My knee made me feel a little bit older, but now that I know we're younger than you, it helps. So first, I'd like to thank both the New York Academy of Sciences and Discover Magazine. It's a pleasure to be presenting, Corey, with your organization, this evening's discussion. The foundation that I chair, Research Corporation for Science Advancement, is the oldest foundation in the nation devoted wholly to science. We're celebrating our 100th anniversary, 100 years of advancing science and of promoting high-risk, high-reward research. From our earliest days, we've been funding some of the most innovative minds in science, including the early work of such now legendary scientists as Robert Goddard and Ernest O. Lawrence, among others. More than 40 of our grantees have been awarded Nobel Prizes, most recently in 2010, and many more are engaged in the potentially transformational research that can fundamentally change our understanding of the world and the universe in which we live. In 1926, Robert Goddard famously launched the world's first liquid-fueled rocket with our corporation's funding. It shot 41 feet into the air, barely 4 stories high, not 40 stories, but 41 feet. And based on that, he proudly reaffirmed his view that reaching the moon was indeed possible. He knew exactly what he was talking about, but he was widely denounced for such a crazy notion. Was he crazy or was he brilliant? At the time, he was widely criticized. Even the New York Times had ridiculed him in an editorial which they corrected more than 4 decades later as Apollo 11 set off for the moon. Crazy or brilliant? That's what we're discussing tonight. How do we foster high-risk, high-reward research? How can it withstand the inevitable ridicule of the widely unimaginable? How do we ensure that America continues to benefit from transformational breakthroughs? To lead tonight's discussion with our distinguished panelists, I'm now delighted to introduce the editor-in-chief of Discover Magazine, Corey Powell.
Thank you for for that very gracious introduction, and thank you for the panel. You've returned from the other dimension. I'm very excited. I just want to give you all, first of all, thank you all so much for turning out tonight. I mean, it's a topic that's very exciting to me because when you're in the journalism world, crazy or brilliant that's just sort of a constant theme that people think about. You hear about research, somebody tells you something that another reporter was writing about, and the stories that are most exciting are the ones that if they're true are transformative, and if they're not true are completely nuts. And the exciting thing about science is that it's often not clear which is which. And the job of these people on the panel is really to figure out what's what, and to figure out basically how to find the brilliant in the crazy, and how to foster the right kind of crazy that leads to the brilliant. Just to give you a little bit of background, this event is part of a series of events that Discover Magazine does with various partners, with the National Science Foundation, with the Chemical Heritage Foundation, with the IEEE, the Institute of Electronic and Electrical Engineers, and tonight, very graciously, with the New York Academy of Science and the Research Corporation for Science Advancement, basically exploring the scientific process and how it touches our lives and how to make it work better for us. This is a particularly exciting panel because I think it breaks out of some of the usual molds of you don't put the money people with the with the applied scientists, with the theoretical scientists, with the journalists. We have all this stuff mixing up here because I think you really need to hear all these different perspectives to really to get at that big question of how do you find the brilliant in the crazy. So let me tell you a little bit about who's on stage. I won't bore you by repeating the biographies that you have in front of you. Shelley Harrison is the senior advisor at Collier Capital. That really only begins to tell you about a career that has gone through many different forms of innovation, many different forms of fundraising, working with early applications of lasers, working on secret defense projects, some of which I still don't entirely know about, and working with NASA on a very innovative project called SpaceHab. We'll hear more about that. Immediately to my left, we have Michael Lipson, who is a computer and electrical engineer at Cornell University, but basically a physicist who works on photonics, which, if I may grossly simplify, is computing with light. Is that a reasonable shorthand? It's a next generation approach to computing and electronics that uses light instead of electricity to make things work faster, smarter, and more efficiently. Immediately to my right, John Gertner, who is a writer and editor at Fast Company magazine. He's also worked at the New York Times magazine, and he's the author of a fabulous new book called the Idea Lab? The Idea Factory. Idea Factory. I knew on stage I would have he grew up in the shadow of Bell Labs. The book talks about the history of Bell Labs as one of the great incubators of innovation in the United States, and certainly, if you look around the room or you look at the devices in your pockets and purses and bags, a lot of those things have a legacy of inventions at Bell Labs. And finally, we have Brian Greene, who is a theoretical physicist at Columbia University. Some of you may know him as the author of The Elegant Universe and The Fabric of the Cosmos. He is a string theorist. He is also involved with the World Science Festival, where he sort of dashed from his hands-on work up there to be down here, and I really appreciate that. And we'll be representing, a more theoretical end of the same question: where do great new ideas come from? And I think especially in the theoretical end, it's an especially acute question of how you know when you're down the right path. So let me start. I mentioned Bell Labs as I think a sort of a quintessential place that we think of as a lot of people have looked at it as an the archetypal incubator for crazy ideas that turn into brilliant ideas. So John, let me throw you a question. Since you've just immersed yourself in this the history and the great discoveries of Bell Labs, what kind of lessons do you take out of that? Of sort of what type of environment is it that fosters the kind of open creativity, and and how do you develop? How do you balance that need for enough structure that you tamp down the crazy, but enough looseness that you raise up the brilliant?
Sure. Maybe I should, for anyone in the audience who doesn't know what Bell Labs was, I mean, it was the R&D arm of the phone company when the phone company was a monopoly. And Bell Labs really, I guess, in its incarnation as this laboratory attached to the phone monopoly, really had its heyday from, I'd say, after the war, after World War II in the 1940s till about the late 1970s. A lot of things came out of there, the transistor, the digital communication satellites, Unix, C language, the CCD chips in our phones, so all that DNA stuff in our electronic devices. I think there are a lot of different ingredients. I was always hoping I could get down to sort of one kind of kernel of wisdom when I was doing these years of reporting. But for one thing, it's obvious it was a product of its time. And I think being attached to the world's largest corporation gave it a stream of money. It gave it the ability to think long term in a way that failure was acceptable, that they could look 5 years, 10 years in advance sometimes without that problem of making quarterly results or even year-end results. The management was excellent. They had technical expertise. They could tolerate a certain amount of failure that a business side executive would not. They gave, at least those in the research department, a tremendous amount of autonomy. I think they had a kind of keen sense of how disciplines could interact and foster new ideas. I think in addition to the interdisciplinary nature, the autonomy, there was a kind of architecture too that they were very careful and intent on combining people in new ways, different ways, loners, and introverts, extroverts, apart from just disciplines, different personalities, applied as well as fundamental, certainly experimentalists and theorists. I think one final point, and it's a little bit different than maybe what will be talked about today, but there was also a manufacturing expertise that was fairly important because the phone company was a kind of A to Z organization that also had one of the biggest manufacturing companies within it called Western Electric. And at Bell Labs, that technology transfer aspect of it, they were going to research new ideas, develop them, sometimes for years on end, decades on end, and by all means, not everything succeeded. There were a lot of failures that I talk about in the book too, but they would also transfer this to the Western Electric factories. And that manufacturing capacity, I think, was fairly vital. I mean, there were certain feedback loops. I've said before that when you're making stuff, you're always thinking about how to make it better. And sometimes some of those really valuable lessons don't just filter back to the sort of shop foreman, but they come back to some of the applied scientists as well, and engineers, as well as eventually sometimes some of the fundamental people who are working on those ideas.
Well, Shelley, you were there. Does any of this sound like what you actually experienced back in the day? And maybe you can talk a little bit about what your experiences led to, what came out of your time working with Bell Labs.
Okay, well, it all resonates with the past, which is a long past now. You mentioned the end of the 70s, but so I would add also that they were very interested in you being able to be educated in anything you wanted to at the time. So as soon as I went to work there, the first thing is they gave me a project. I designed it in 3 days, and then it took me the rest of the 2 months of the summer to make it work. And again, I had to go into Western Electric, and I had to go into some of the groups there to actually fabricate. They said, fabricate it. Don't just give us paper.
Talk a little bit about what you were working toward at the time.
Well, at that little period of time, it was doing something in the microwave world that had to do with things that they were doing for the military. Actually, the Bell Labs that I went to was the group in Whippany, which was working on the nation's anti-missile system. And we were charged with building a defense system against, at that time, the Soviet Union. And the war gaming was going on in terms of trying to defeat everything we were doing from the RAND group. So the other thing, also in terms of my knowledge after the 2 months in the summer, they said, gee, you had to learn more about microwaves. Go to the school of your choice. So they gave me, go to Stanford, go to MIT, or go to Brooklyn Poly. Interestingly, Brooklyn Poly in those days was, they felt #1, so I went there. And I took a degree in electrophysics. At the same time, they had the first laser group in the world at the time. And so I started to absorb all that stuff, and I got real excited. Went back to Bell, started working on the stuff for the anti-missile system, but I was publishing in the laser world because that became my excitement.
And now at the time, it wasn't exactly clear what lasers were good for in terms of consumer use. Is that right?
Yeah, well, so a lot of people thought that'd be great for light shows for rock bands.
And that actually turned out to be true. I hear Pink Floyd did very well.
Yeah,
with that.
jumping ahead to your other question, what did I do with some of this? So following on that, I went back to get my license. They said, you need a PhD to write these papers because the guys at Murray Hill just that's their field. So I went and got this degree, and instead of going back to Bell Labs, I went to teach at SUNY Stony Brook and became professor for quantum electronics and stuff. Of course, my salary was about 1/3 of what I was making at Bell Labs, so it was rough. And along came some people and said to me, you know all about lasers, and we want to do inventory control. I said, well, who do you represent? Well, we represent the supermarket industry. Oh, I said, well, I don't know anything about supermarkets. Well, here's the lesson. We need inventory control because basically a supermarket, retail is a browsing warehouse, and the number of turns are very important, and we've got to know what's on the shelf or what needs to be on the shelf. So I said, okay, what do you want me to do? Well, IBM, this brings up the other point. Bell Labs also made a lot of things public domain. They could afford to do that. And that meant it wasn't just them exploiting it and commercializing it, bringing it out to the world. It meant lots of others had the opportunity. I bring that up because IBM did it too. IBM Labs, Watson, and they did it with the barcode. The barcode that you see on all these products and everything around the world was the universal product code. It was basically IBM's selection. It was beautiful. So I was on some committee that helped pick that, and I immediately went home and said, to my wife and to another fellow who was working with me, we're starting a company. What are we going to do? We're going to make laser scanners to read barcodes. So Daniel, my son there, can attest to the fact. My wife said, well, where are the barcodes? Oh, they're not there yet. So can we wait? Can we wait until they're there, keep working, make some money, and we'll do the company later. But, I sort of insisted we got to run and do this. So one of the things that came out of all of this was my knowledge of lasers, some of the other things that I had learned back at Bell Labs, and things I was currently doing in research at SUNY Stony Brook. So I took the leap. The company is Symbol Technologies, and you've all seen our scanners all over the world. And there's a whole big story, which I won't go into how to get there. But here was a situation where the passion was that for myself and for a partner, we saw this as automatic data entry. And automatic data entry, we wrote a plan that went beyond the supermarkets, in the dashboards of your cars, on the production lines of the world, everything. It was going to be all ubiquitous. Nobody believed this, though, so it was very hard to raise money with 9 venture capitalists in this nation. So that's another story.
Yeah, that's another thing that I think we want to come back to, which is, of course, take an idea and turning it into a commercial product. At some point, somebody with money has to believe that you are brilliant and not crazy, and that is, and you've had some experience there too. And I'd like to. We'll circle back to that, but I think you touched on an interesting theme of how you take an idea that has obvious theoretical interest and how you find a practical application in it, and that's something, Michal, that you've also dealt with. Photonics, in its essence, it's a discipline of physics. It's understanding the movement and interaction of light, but it also has big practical implications. How did you make that leap from the theoretical to the practical?
So that's a good point. I did my PhD in basic physics, very semiconductor physics. That had absolutely no direct applications, and then when I started my career in Cornell, I had to pick. When you start your own group, you have to differentiate yourself from your advisors and make a path for yourself. I wanted to pick a subject that would still keep the fundamentals, learn new physics and try to discover how things work, but have direct applications so that in 3-4 years, I would see direct high impact. And I was lucky that at that time there is still, but at that time the microelectronic industry was thirsty for a solution for Moore's law. Basically, today, if you go buy a computer, the speed of the computer is going to be the same as it was 2 years ago, and it's all because of power. Computers are getting harder and harder. And what consumes most of the power in a computer is just moving data from one point to another. And today, data is moved using electrical wires, but light doesn't consume any power. So this is basically the idea of introducing light to move a lot of data from one point to another on a computer chip. And it was an idea that it was very hard to do it as a young professor, because as a young professor you have no credibility. So again, raising funding and getting people to pay attention.
So what happened when you suggested this isn't just a theoretical interest, this has a practical interest? What was the response?
Well, I do remember giving lots of talks and seeing a lot of rolling eyes I also remember trying to get funding from Intel and so on, and getting relatively similar response. That was I started 2001. 2004, we had our biggest result. And I was just telling John that I had a meeting with Intel CTO. That was 2 weeks ago. We are in 2012. It's already in production in Intel. So it was very fast, relatively fast moving for this type of era. But you have to really take a deep breath and be okay with having a lot of blood on your... and having corporations like research corporations like that have no strings attached makes a big difference.
So, I mean, that raises an interesting question. You mentioned, essentially that there's a certain amount of impatience involved, that you wanted to see your research ideas in action, and if you can make a commercial case and actually get a commercial backer, there's a fairly quick and fairly specific process of how you find out, does this work? Does this have potential? When you're in a theoretical field, you don't have that luxury or that pressure, depending on how you look at it. You've spent a career in theoretical physics, in string theory. When you started, string theory was not considered a particularly mainstream or popular area of physics, was it?
Actually, when I started graduate school back in 1984, string theory really didn't exist on the landscape of physics. There were a few people that were pursuing it, but it was very much a backwater area. And then one paper was written that showed that certain issues that nobody thought string theory would be able to solve could be resolved theoretically, mathematically. And then thousands of people dropped what they were doing and started to work on the field. So it went through a pretty dramatic transition from nobody even heard of it to a core group of, say 1,000 people in the world working on it. And those people were definitely viewed as this sort of renegade group of physicists that were trying to shake up the establishment. And so there's a lot of resistance at that time from those who had been working on more traditional approaches for decades.
So let me jump in here for a second, because that sounds like one of the the kind of crazy or brilliant moments that we're trying to drill down on a bit. In the theoretical world, what was it about that paper? How did people recognize that this was a real, this was a landmark, this was a big shift in the theory?
Well, it wasn't the way one normally envisions things to happen in physics, which is you have some data, you have some experiment, nobody can explain it, somebody comes along with a new theory, explains the data, and it's clear that this is the way to go forward, right? It wasn't like that at all. And the reason why it wasn't like that is largely because we had been so successful in that approach for so many decades that many of the remaining issues that we can contemplate are beyond the reach of experiment or beyond the reach of observation. So this development was purely theoretical, and there was a very well-known stumbling block en route to trying to have a unified theory. This is Einstein's dream of being able to have a set of mathematical equations that would be stitched into one unified whole that would be able to describe all the forces of nature. And there was this proposal that not many people knew about, this string theory, but there was a key problem, an equation that didn't work, literally, and it meant that the theory was inconsistent. And along came a couple of researchers who had been thinking about this for a long time, John Schwartz, Michael Green, no relation to me, and they found a way to make that equation work. That's as simple as it was. It had a right-hand side that wasn't zero, and it needed to be zero, and they found a way to make it zero.
And, so,
And that was it.
And so actually, maybe because I think with the question of with a supermarket scanner or with a faster computer, the end result is pretty clear. What is the end result of string theory? What would constitute success, and what would it mean?
Well, the end result would not in any direct way help any of the gadgets that we know about. It wouldn't put food on anybody's table, but the end result would be the crowning moment of our species, when we would, and that I think means something, right? Where we would, in principle, know the basic constituents of matter, the basic forces by which they interact, and therefore all of the fundamental processes that underlie everything that we're talking about in some theoretical sense. And that, to many of us, is the prime goal that we're shooting for. Thank you very much. It's been enjoyable. Now, I should say...
The next stage of evolution begins right here.
Now, I should quickly say, we are so far away from that goal today because while we have this theory in front of us, there is so much about it that we don't yet understand, and it has zero experimental support. Now, some of my colleagues get a little bit irritated when I say zero experimental support, because there are hints, but they're not the kind of hints that you want to stand behind and say, oh, there's the proof of it. No way. People sometimes describe me as a proponent of string theory, a believer in string theory. It drives me nuts. I am not a believer in string theory. I do not believe in it. I am not a proponent of string theory. I am only a believer in things that have experimental proof, observational support. Do I think string theory has great promise? Do I think it's the best thing to be working on if you're shooting for a unified theory? Absolutely. But will I believe it? No, only when it's experimentally proven.